Hello students, today I am going to be talking to you about the West Atlantic Forests region, which is along the western coast of Africa. And we have a nice map here so you can see the countries we're going to be looking at. And as I mentioned in our last slideshow, it was the Portuguese who were first really exploring the world with their sailboats, and well, not the first people ever in the world, but that we have in written history, in Western recorded history, let's say that. So it was 15th century Portuguese adventurers who were sailing along the western coast of Africa, and they decided to call it Guinea. And then for centuries to follow, Europeans used that term referring to most of the West African coast. But really it refers to a much larger area than just the country of Guinea. So it refers to Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire. And on this map too, you can see the names of the different tribes that live in the areas. Different areas, Temne, Mende, Baga, Jola Basari, and so on. And we'll be looking at them predominantly in this slideshow. And although the peoples of this region all speak languages that are of the Niger-Congo family, the ones that speak the West Atlantic languages are the ones that we believe were the first inhabitants of the region. But over the past 5 centuries, some of the earlier cultures have been displaced and absorbed by the expansion of inland cultures that are related to the Mande-speaking peoples, such as the Bamana. And if you've taken African art with me, you might remember I mentioned that one of the ways in which we know how people are related to each other is through language. So the language of the later immigrants is known as core Mande or peripheral Mande, depending on their degree of relationship to the speech of the Malinke and the Soninke, who are in Mali. And during the 19th century, former slaves from the regions of Africa and settlers from the Americas added to this ethnic complexity, which we see particularly in Liberia, which was settled by former African American slaves. And perhaps in relationship to these ethnic interrelationships, religious associations in the region cross both linguistic and cultural boundaries. And the art forms that are connected to these associations are shared by other cultures nearby, even sometimes when their languages are unrelated. So it can actually be a little bit confusing trying to keep all of these people together. Sometimes, for example, somebody from one tribe may go into another village, another tribe's village, and see a mask there that they like. They may buy it from them, and then they will adapt it for their own purposes. So sometimes it's difficult for this reason to reconstruct the history of art here. So even if the name and usage of one specific art object has been documented, there may be similar undocumented works that served a very different function from the works that are documented. So it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. And the arts of the West Atlantic forest include things like bold murals, elegant ceramic vessels, ornaments, and instruments of metal, intricately woven fabrics, and dyed bark cloth. But it's particularly famous for its masquerades. And as I said in the previous slideshow, this is the one region of Africa where women have their own particular masquerades, and women may even wear the masks themselves. And in this slide, you're seeing the Sawe mask of the Mende people, and it's part of the women's initiations, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And masquerades bring all different kinds of creative efforts together, sculptors, performers, attendants, musicians, spectators, and the artist who carves a wooden head or a face for the mask might sometimes be the one who paints it or embellish it, but often it's ornamented and costumed by its owner, by the person who's actually going to dance it. And the dancer who performs the mask needs to be sensitive to the expectations of whatever spirit is thought to be empowering it and by the aspirations of its owner. And we saw this a little bit in the last slideshow. The ability to create art forms that addressed many different needs has allowed artists from the region to sculpt art forms for foreigners with great success. and during the 15th and 16th centuries, coastal artists carved works for Portuguese patrons, and then those eventually found their way into the courts of Europe. And then during the 19th and 20th centuries, there were new forms of art and architecture made for Muslim communities and foreign settlers. So these inventive and innovative artworks all meld these different traditions together with the aesthetic heritage of the West Atlantic forests. So we're going to look first at the very early arts. And it's very difficult to do archaeological excavations in the forest, so we don't know a lot about the work that was produced prior to European contact. However, we have some very interesting sculpture in stone and ivory, and we know that that was being made at least as early as the 15th century when the Portuguese first arrived. So the statues in this particular slide, as I mentioned in the last slideshow, a lot of times art pieces are found by accident. So these were actually found accidentally by diamond hunters and farmers, and they're carved from soapstone and other types of rock. And in lands that are now owned by the Mende people, the farmers will take these figures and will stand them up in their own rice fields or palm groves, and they feel that they're representatives of the previous people who lived there before, so they give them offerings and ask them to bring abundant harvests to the current people who are living there. And for generations, farmers in Sierra Leone and adjoining portions of Liberia and Guinea have found these figures. And the imagery and the styles are very different from each other, especially amongst those that are found by the Kissi and the Kono people. And in the lands that are now owned by the Mende people, farmers place excavated stone figures or freestanding heads in their rice fields or palm groves, and they're regarded as representatives of the previous owners of the land, and the objects are given offerings and asked to bring abundant harvests. And if they do not do what they ask of them, they might curse them or whip them. It's a little bit different from the way we approach prayer in Western culture. So the Mende call these stone figures Nomolisa, or Nomolicia, singular Nomoli, or Mali Yafizia, found spirits, and when they find buried caches of metal rings or figures and heads adorned with rings, both the metal and stone objects are called spirits of leaders, and they're treated with great respect, and they might serve as the visual and spiritual centerpieces of shrines and other assemblages of sacred material where important oaths would be sworn. And some people like to use the term Nomoli for the style of these figures, but there's some that come from non-Mende areas, so a better term might actually be coastal style. This is actually a photograph from your book, since most are found within 100 miles of the ocean. So the coastal style figures have the domed foreheads, full noses and mouths, and eyes that are precisely carved as spherical globes. They kind of look like cowrie shells or coffee beans or something. And this particular figure is representing possibly a corpse lying on a bier, and the lines across the mouth might show that it had a beard, which is common on figures in this style, or it might refer to the practice of binding a king as part of his installation ceremony, which is something that the Temne still do today. And this is a sculpted stone head from Sierra Leone, and it might have been a Mahayafe if it was found by a Mende farmer, and it would be set on a firm base formed by a very thick conical neck, as you can see here. And like other examples, it was made as an independent work, so it didn't come off of, a full figure of a human being. And sometimes it shares some figures. Yes, it shares some features with the coastal style figures that we described above. It has other characteristics like a sharp division between the head and the neck and the way that the face is sort of upturned, and that's only found in the stone heads. And then as is common in these heads, the hair is sculpted into a top knot, and then there's large rings in the ears. And the heavy eyelids are almost closed, and they give the face an expression of reserved calm. And when the Kissi of Guinea and other parts of Sierra Leone unearth stone figures, including those in the coastal style, they call them the dead, Pomtan, or in the singular Pomdo. And a Kissi farmer who finds one of these images will have dreams to link it to a deceased family member, and then the dream allows him to name it after that ancestor, and then he would put it in a shrine with smooth uncarved rocks in a shrine that is dedicated to the ancestors. And then it might first be adorned with beads and coins, maybe surrounded by cloth wrappings or a wooden case before it's put in the shrine. And a corpse is carried on a plank by mourners, and so it's believed to cause the plank to move in response to questions. A swaddled ancestor's figure might be placed on a piece of wood and then carried on the head of its guardian during divination ceremonies where they're trying to divine the future. And all of these stone figures in non-coastal styles have been given by the Kisi names like Pomtan and Pomdo by art historians, even if they weren't found in Kisi territory. And it might actually be better to refer to them as inland styles rather than giving them a specific ethnic assignment. And some of these styles have simple cylinders with rudimentary faces or spherical heads attached to cylindrical bodies. Others are quite detailed. So this particular one shows a figure with an open mouth and teeth, and he seems to be actually on top of something that he's riding, and he's grasping either horns or reins. And then, as is typical of the style, his eyes have the shapes of grains of rice, and then the forehead emerges with an elaborate hairstyle or maybe a crown. And these particular sculptures can't at this time be dated by physical analysis. There was an eroded wooden figure in the coastal style, and so that was given dates of about AD 1200 to 1400. It's hard to know. Additional support, though, for these dates comes from a remarkable body of art that we're going to look at next. We saw a little bit of it in the previous slideshow, and these objects are known as the Sapi Portuguese ivories. So, again, when the Portuguese explorers came to Sierra Leone, they encountered a cluster of people that they referred to as the Sapi. And the Sapi are no longer inhabiting this region. They might have been killed off or maybe integrated into the cultures that are there today. But at the time, they extended from the central coastline of present-day Guinea to the central coastline of present-day Sierra Leone. And they are ancestors of the Bolam, the Temne, and the Baga, and they were also related to the Kisi. So they were considered to be prosperous and created very beautiful ivory objects, as you see here. So if you remember from the last slideshow, we saw a salt cellar. So here we have another one. We're going to look at a couple of different examples of salt cellars that they made. So the Portuguese sailors might have collected these objects as souvenirs while they were visiting the Sapi region. And by the last decades of the 15th century, they had started actually commissioning works from the Sapi that they could take home to Europe. So they created things like spoons, cylindrical boxes, hunting horns, and covered bowls, all which are very, very detailed and very beautifully carved. And covered bowls, such as the one here, kind of look like European chalices in the way that they are shaped. However, these, as I mentioned, they were used as salt cellars, and as I mentioned before, salt was something that was very expensive in Renaissance Europe, and so if you could afford it, you wanted something elaborate to show it off on your table. So the shape of this ivory salt cellar might have been based on tableware that the captains owned on the Portuguese ship. But what's interesting, if you look at the geometric patterns, they might have been developed from Sapi designs that were used in scarification or calabash decoration or decoration on pottery or even decorations that they put on their houses. So we're going to look at a close-up of the object, and this is the lid. As I mentioned before, this portion here, the bowl portion, would hold the salt, and then this would be the lid. So looking at a close-up here, we see crocodiles that are attacking a nude figure, biting his head. And the crocodile is a very potent image in the arts of Guinea today, so it might have something to do with the religious beliefs of the period, but it might have also been something that would be considered exotic or exciting or titillating to the Europeans. And then on the bottom, we have this beautiful ring of figures that encircle the vessel, and they're carved in the coastal style. And their heads, if you look, are just a little bit more delicate than the Nomoli heads. So they're contemporary, maybe, with the timing of those. And the female figures are only wearing little wrappers or skirts and appear to be Sapi women, and the male figures have their hands folded as if in prayer, and they appear to be Portuguese. And the supportive or possessive gestures of the female figures remind us that during this time there were marriages between the Portuguese traders and the African women, and these were creating prosperous family partnerships all along the western coasts of Africa. And to this day, there are people of Portuguese African descent living in that area. So today, a lot of leaders in Sierra Leone and Liberia, when they appear, will have horns accompanying them, blowing and so forth. And centuries ago, horns might have inspired Portuguese visitors to request Sapi artists to carve imitations of European hunting horns or olifants. And unlike instruments that they carved for local African usage, the olifants, which if you think it sounds like elephant, you're right. It's named for the elephant whose tusks supplied the ivory. They were blown from the tip of the tusk rather than from a hole on a concave surface. So on this we have all kinds of little European things like hunting dogs, stags. Yeah, here's our hunting dogs. Here's some stags, and other beasts that you might hunt. And the huntsmen all have little tiny coastal style faces. There's one right there. And these images were evidently taken from illustration in books that the Portuguese brought, from illustrations in the books that the Portuguese brought, and they were given to the Sapi as models. And then they've got nice bands of ornamentation, sometimes braided, sometimes just geometric, very beautiful, and they separate the scenes into registers in the way that the frames in the pages of a book would be framed by designs. And then there's coats of arms here of the kings of Spain. And so the horn was probably intended for a Spanish aristocrat. And Fernandez noted whatever sort of object is drawn for them, they can carve in ivory. So he's basically promoting their great skill. And Sapi artists created such faithful renditions of European images that eventually people thought they were actually created by European artists. Only recently had they been identified as African. And these Sapi Portuguese ivories were able to lose their African identity very easily because, as I've been saying, they're the earliest examples of what art historians have called tourist art. So they were made to satisfy foreign visitors rather than to be used in their culture of origin. And Portuguese records indicate that Mande-speaking warriors appeared on the coast in the 1500s, and they disrupted and destroyed a lot of Sapi communities. And by the end of the 16th century, the Sapi were no longer making ivories for export, unfortunately. And a lot of people today in Sierra Leone carve things in wood, but they're very different from what the Sapi were doing. So now we'll talk a little bit about some of the masks and masquerades in this portion of West Africa. And masquerades are meant to celebrate rites of passage, as we've seen, such as moving into a higher age grade from one to another. Also funerary rites, some social activities, and celebrations. So we're going to look first at the Casamance region, which is the region south of the Gambia River. And most of the information we have on this region comes from the Jola people. And many of the masks and masquerades of this region were under attack by Islam under the previous governmental regime, but some are returning. So while some sculpture of the West Atlantic forest can be dated to the 16th century, there's no mention of masks in those accounts up until the 17th century. So masquerades were apparently documented first in the northern portions of the West Atlantic forests. So we're going to look at a brief survey of regional West Atlantic masquerades beginning north and moving southward. And we'll actually, I'm going to divide this slideshow into two parts. so it's a little bit easier. So when we come to the Mende, that'll be the end of this slideshow, and we'll do a part 2. So we're going to look first at the initiations of the Jula, the Bidjogo, and their neighbors. And in the last years of the 17th century, a European traveler named Frogger said that he saw a circumcised man wearing a horned headdress in the town of Barra on the banks of the Gambia River, and Europeans knew the region south of that river as the Casamance, after the Casamansa, or the king of the Mansa people. And the Casa still live today in the Casamance region. So they don't perform masquerades today, but there's several neighboring groups that do. And what you're looking at here is the Ajumba mask, which is what the Jula people use today. And this is actually a little bit older. This is a woven horned headdress, and a lot of them have entered European collections during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Jula themselves called them a kabul, and as I said, that is an older version of a rare horned mask called the Ajumba, which you see here in this slide. And an Ajumba might sometimes appear in Jula communities when the young men of a particular age grade come back from their ordeals and their training period that prepares them for adulthood. And this would be worn only by the spiritual leaders. If you look, the eyes are tubular, and those are associated with clairvoyance and their ability to perceive supernatural forces. And then the fiery color of the seeds that they affix to the woven surface of the mask might assist these young men in their battles with sorcerers, while the white seashells are used to predict the future. And one of the things that you see that these masks all have in common, even though they may look different from each other, are the horns. Cattle are extremely important in this particular region, actually in many regions of Africa, but we're going to look specifically how they are reflected in the masquerades here. So horned masks like the Ajumba are a lot rarer today amongst the Jula than they are amongst neighboring groups like the Balanta. But today, still some youths will dance in caps like this that support cow horns at the beginning of their initiation. And some of these horned headdresses are elaborate constructions that will have also mirrors and cloth coming off of them. And this is very interesting. Now, this is not a horned headdress, but we will talk about what the significance of this is. So as I said, the horns are really important because they show the success of the young men in cattle raids. So one of the things that is expected of young men in the Casamance region is that they go and raid their neighbors' cattle, and this is supposed to show cattle are wealth. So it gives them wealth, enough wealth to marry, also shows their military abilities by doing these cattle raids. And today the horns also testify to the generosity and prosperity of the community that supports the initiates, because they're taken from the cattle slaughtered to provide meat for the feasts that are given on behalf of these young men. And the horn and masks in their headdresses also have their counterpart in the age grade displays of the Koniagi and the Basari, who live to the southeast of the Jula on the border between Guinea and Senegal. And the circumcised boys of the Basari are supervised by two older age grades. They are symbolically killed and then reborn as men. And then each of the supervisory grades appears in elaborate finery. So what you're looking at are a series of photographs from the previous slide and this one, and it's showing us the three age grades in a Basari community wearing these woven discs with radiating attachments of fabric and fiber. And as you can see, in some cases their faces are hidden behind mosquito netting. And evidently these are the younger supervisors. The older supervisors wear huge headdresses with crests of palm fiber, colored palm fiber. And here you can see a headdress that actually looks exactly like a cow or a bull. So the male age grades of the Bidjogo, a West Atlantic speaking group that live on the Bisagos Islands, which are off the coast of Guinea-Bissau, are known for their striking costumes and masquerades. And just as Casamance boys wear horned caps to show that their age grade is preparing for initiation, some Bidjogo boys wear horned headdresses when their age grade is formed. So Casamance peoples identify the young men with the bull's sacrifice so that when the ceremonies begin, the members of the youngest age grade are actually dressed as calves. And then Bidjoggo boys, also wearing headdresses, link them to non-threatening species of fish. Kind of interesting. So here's one of those. And when a Bidjoggo age grade goes through the first level, its members become warriors and prepare for initiation into mature adulthood. And the new warriors will wear heavy headdresses and other wooden attachments like feet or fins. So they're mimicking the appearance of whatever animal, whether it's a swordfish, a shark, a hippopotamus, or a crocodile. And all of these animals are considered very dangerous for the seagoing peoples of the Bidjoggo, and these large, heavy costumes are meant to show the courage and the strength of the dancers. And these particularly evocative helmet masks allow some Bidjoggo warriors to actually become untamed and ferocious bulls. So, as I said, they were actually, they still do raid cattle. So bulls are associated with cattle raids and that type of warfare. And cattle masquerades will imitate the bellowing charges and behavior of untamed bulls. So in some cases, they might actually be held back with ropes so that they don't go charging off into the spectators. And should Bidjoggo youths die before their age grade has been initiated into full adulthood, they're thought to become restless spirits, so their ghosts have to be laid to rest by girls who will undergo initiation on their behalf. So during the final initiation ceremonies of the male age grade, there might be young women who wear headdresses similar to those worn by the boys. And then each young woman is believed to be possessed by the spirit of one of the youths who died. And during the ceremony, she'll speak to his family through her chants and her gestures. And the rites are then a vivid reminder of each individual's value to his relatives and to the community. And so here is some other images. Here are some other images of some pretty spectacular masquerades. And in the 1930s, Papel initiates might dress as enormous sea snails, and they might also have models of sailing ships on their heads. And sometimes people might wear actually had dresses in the shape of airplanes. And today, these people don't have the same elaborate age grade ceremonies, but they do have Carnival. And so they have very wonderful, inventive masquerades for the Carnival celebrations. So Carnival in Bissau, which is the capital of Guinea-Bissau, is linked to the islands in Cape Verde and the celebrations that they have, and also Brazil, which was also visited and colonized by the Portuguese. So it's inspired by the Christian calendar, but it has a very secular focus. And so this is very interesting. This is secular rather than religious. What you're looking at here are papier-mâché costumes from a 1987 Carnival, and it's basically promoting inoculations. So one is in the shape of a syringe with a face on it, which is kind of crazy looking. And then there's this one here, which is supposed to be a child with a great big belly. And then they all have huge ears. And they might appear completely modern in both style and imagery, but they are direct descendants of those sailing ships and airplanes of the earlier 20th century masquerades. And then just as age grade masquerades link the Bidjoggo to people on the mainland, certain protective artworks are also shared by West Atlantic speakers as well, although they might have slightly different forms and slightly different names. So the Bidjoggo use hollow cylinders that are covered with red cloth to house guardian spirits, and both the sacred object and its indwelling spirits are often known by the Creole term Iran. And the most important of these spirit beings is the divinity who oversees a town or a lineage known as Orabak Okoto. And these images are owned by the male leader of the community, but both in Iran and its shrine would be cared for by a woman. And one Iran, as that we have here in this slide, for Orabak Okoto, is surmounted, topped by a human head, wearing a 19th century top hat, which actually to this day we see people wearing in West Africa. And the imported metal set into the eyes adds some interest to the sculpture, both aesthetically and economically. And then what we have here is a type of object similar to an Iran, and this is from the coast of northwestern Guinea, and these lands are populated by small populations, including the Baga groups, the Nalu, and the Londuman. So here, the image is known by a variety of names. Most of the Baga call it an atchal, which is a word that they'll translate as medicine, although other terms might be used by the Baga and the Nalu. So like the Iran that we saw of Orobak Okoto, an atchal has a cylindrical base with one or more openings where you might put different herbs that are spiritually charged and maybe sacrifices like ashes or bones or libations on the inside. And then it's got a somewhat human-like forehead, and it says an ear, and a nose coming out, and then it goes out into this long curved bird-like beak. And so it's thought to be a composite creature made up of several different creatures that can travel through the air, the water, and earth. And it also refers to wealth and to elegance and leadership through the expensive metal studs, the beautiful carving on the lid and the base, which represents stools that would be used by leaders. And an atchal would be owned by the head of a clan. It's seen as a manifestation of God, and it's considered to be a judge, a healer, and also supreme authority within the clan. So a Baga leader would guard it in a shrine along with other important relics, a powerful helmet mask, and other substances that have supernatural power. And some of the potent materials might actually go into the geometric holes in the head and then into the cylindrical base as well. And during important events in the lives of clan members, the head of an atchal might be detached from the base and even worn on the head by a dancer. And these events include planting and harvest ceremonies and the settlement of major disputes. And before the colonial era, they had no kings, no judges, lawyers, police, or prisons, and their lives were instead ruled by elders, prophets, and the sacred powers that an art object like this would have. Atchal are joined by a large number of other masquerades in the region of the West Atlantic forests. And a particularly impressive type is called Atchal Matchal Ngacho, which means master of medicine, in one Baga group. And outsiders often refer to it by the foreign name Basoni, which is taken from the neighboring Susu people who've admired its performances. So in this case, it is a serpent-like being, apparently danced by the Nalu and Londuman peoples in addition to the Baga. And each masquerade might be sponsored by a specific lineage. All are inspired by a serpent spirit who's common throughout the region and who is identified with the water and the rainbow, with fertility, and with wealth. So this is what it looks like when it's attached to the costume and a person is wearing it. You can see the legs down here, and then this is just the top part as it came to be sold in some Western gallery. So here you can see the diamond-shaped markings on both, actually, and this is on the surface of the wooden snake, and it's balanced by the dancer, and that's heightened by the patterns that are on the cloth that surround the base and cover the dancer's raffia cloak. And then the round eyes of the serpent, which are always mentioned as frightening and piercing, are isolated and emphasized by their placement at the top. And this particular photograph was not taken during a performance, but it shows how the sculpture is balanced on the dancer's head. And people describe how it actually moves, that it actually would glide smoothly over the rice fields, leaving the forest to appear on the outskirts of the community for the masquerade. And then this is another dramatic masquerade that's known as Banda amongst the Nalu and Kumbaduba amongst the Baga. And this is a very heavy wooden mask that combines the jaws of the crocodile, the horns of the antelope, the sensitive ears of a forest creature, and the tail of a chameleon, which is located between the horns of the masks. And then the prominent nose recalls the nose on the atchal, although other surfaces on the larger headdress are much flatter and more geometric. And the elaborate crested hairstyle of Atchol actually appears on Banda, but here, instead of scarification being showed by being carved in, instead it's painted, and there are no metal tacks. And some of the floral stellar shapes that ornament the Banda are similar to those that you might find on imported dishes or other trade goods, and they might be related to motifs on textiles that would have once been woven in Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and the Cape Verde Islands for African and European patrons. And the Banda is renowned for its spectacular dance movements, for its ability to spin high in the air and low to the ground, and it has a lot of acrobatics that are extraordinary. If you look at that mask, it's actually very heavy and would have to sit on somebody's head. So you'd have to be quite an athlete to be able to pull that off. And in the 19th century, Banda seems to have appeared at initiations, harvests, and funerals, but nowadays it's mostly danced for entertainment. And recent masquerades are actually often associated with Islam. So this is one well-documented form known as al-Buraq, which was invented by a Baga artist named Salou Baki in 1955. And al-Buraq is an adaptation of a mysterious winged woman, a woman-headed mare, who is believed to have carried the Prophet Muhammad on a mystical flight. So here, the body of the horse has been transformed into a box, and the female head is now male. And like the serpent masquerade and the dance to Atchol, al-Buraq is a three-dimensional wooden sculpture placed on top of a narrow stem that is then enveloped in raffia and covered with cloth, so you can't see the body of the dancer underneath. And Saku Baki's son learned to create shapes with rulers and compasses at school, so the artist adapted these for the designs of the masquerade, which you can see it much better here. There's the head. And the multicolored shapes on the white surface also kind of remind us of ones that we've seen on the earlier Banda masks. And at the time al-Buraq was invented, Muslim missionaries were converting a lot of the coastal peoples of Guinea, and as they went, destroying their sacred art objects. So this iconoclasm, and that basically means, iconoclasm means the destruction of images. So this continued during the Marxist regime of 1958 through 1984, when most non-Muslim art forms were banned. And only ostensibly new masquerades associated with Islam, such as al-Buraq, could be danced without fear of reprisal. And one of the masquerades, I mentioned this in the last slideshow, is Dimba or Nimba, and this was prohibited by the government. And she represents a strong, mature woman. She represents the ideal mature woman who, over time, her breasts have been flattened out by having suckled many children and by having tied them to her back. And it's huge. So the person's head goes under here. And here is a nice photograph of how it looks when someone's wearing it. So she towers over everybody else. And you would have had to be very strong in order to move very gracefully and serenely through the town like a goddess. And so she would greet important visitors, and her image could be seen on other art forms associated with female leaderships. And women might come and touch her breasts or her swirling fiber skirts in order to try to have healthy children or productive fields. And since 1984, non-Islamic religious arts are no longer illegal, and masquerades can now be danced more openly. And revivals of Dimba may now join a host of newer performances, including smaller and more naturalistic versions of female busts atop a cloth and raffia base. So she's once again considered to be civilized, beautiful, and an inspiration to the women of the community. And of all the masquerades in this region, Dimba is closest to the women's masks of Sierra Leone and Western Liberia. And it is here that I'm going to stop, because we will be getting into the Mende and the Temne and the masks that are danced by women in our next slideshow. And I also don't want these to be overly long, so I will close here, and I hope you all have a terrific day.